A scientist discovers a way to teleport matter, but something goes awry when he tries to send himself through his invention. That's basically the story, of course, of The Fly, the original being made in 1958, with the remake in 1986 by David Cronenberg, which this will mark the start of our discussion of the Cronenberg remakes. I'm John Chang with Dan Edmonds.
Hello there. I'm no longer live from Aero Garden. They didn't give us any sponsorship money, so I decided, sod it. I mean, just going to have to look at the back of my kitchen instead.
So this time, I thought the interesting question would be about, like what directors have influenced you personally, like really made a lasting impression, and why?
For me, I would say that it's more surreal directors and surrealist movies, or ones that really kind of skirt with the edge of what is taboo or acceptable. The ones that really kind of stay with me. I think just because of this sort of subconscious element, is sort of slightly incongruous connections between various things that you wouldn't have otherwise thought of. Often the ones that sort of stay with me. One director who I think is very underrated, or doesn't seem to get as much work, but someone who I think has the most incredible visual flair is Tarsem Singh, who did The Immortals and The Cell with J-Lo, no less. And I mean, his visual imagery is really incredible. And also he has there's something about the way his scenes are paced, that they have a very kind of dreamlike quality to them as well. I think that's, for me, is it. I mean, I kind of feel like because dreams are inherently narrative based, in that we take events that happen to us in everyday life, and they're sort of affect us in either a traumatic or otherwise way, and then dreams are kind of like our way of stitching these together into a narrative that kind of makes sense. So I sort of feel that any narrative medium draws on dreams in order to compel us and make us interested in them.
Nice. Yeah, for me, it's one that we probably both share, is George Lucas, where for me I still can remember the feeling of walking out of the first time I saw Star Wars, like kind of when it was just, wasn't known as Episode 4 or anything like that. It was just Star Wars, and feeling like, like it was one of the few times that, like, I'd seen many different things, of course, even as a kid, even that I'd seen things that, like, they were cool, they were fast, they held my attention and stuff, but I didn't have that experience before of, like, feeling like looking up at the stars and, like, like thinking like somewhere out there there's like this other world, and I kind of that, like, and I felt like for a moment, in those couple hours, he took us to this other world, and so that's something is a feeling that, like, I still look forward to it in the movie and stuff. And so for me, that was the impact that I realized that somebody could have, as a filmmaker, through story, to kind of teleport us and stuff. So that's kind of, I'd say, what really kind of for me has been an experience that I still kind of really love when like a filmmaker does achieve it.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say with George Lucas, it's his detail of the mythology that he created, and the amount of you would see something and you just wouldn't understand why that particular little detail was like that, but there was a huge amount of thought that was sort of put into all of that, and it was more like, basically, the characters are almost sort of accessories to the events in the world itself, and that was what was really intriguing about it. And it's similar with George R. Martin with Game of Thrones. Basically the world is what really is the focus of the story, not so, and the characters kind of just want to weave their way through it. But yeah.
Yes. So speaking of worlds, so in this world that is created with the Fly and stuff, it's funny how the original novel, or the short story rather, by George Langelaan, was set in France, and then the movie is kind of moves things to the Western Hemisphere to what's called Canada and stuff. And for the most part, a lot of the things translate because we're in the French part of Canada and stuff. With Andre is, of course, the scientist and stuff, and then Hélène is his wife, and the actor playing him is at this point known, I guess, or is credited as Al Hedison. He's later known as David Hedison, which I kind of pretty much know more from the Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea television series and stuff. That was a series I really enjoyed. He was like kind of, definitely what made that what it was. The screenplay, by the way, was written by James Clavell, and this is way before he became known for his novel writing, of course, with things like Shogun. And but a few years later, the next major screenplay he would write would be The Great Escape, which unfortunately or fortunately doesn't have a remake. It's probably one of those that you almost hope they don't do a remake because they can only botch it up and stuff. But yeah, definitely that's one of my favorite classics and stuff.
I think if we've learned anything from this, is that it's just a matter of time before they remake it. It's basically, you just got to have enough people who've forgotten that it's a classic, and then it's like, oh well, people don't really know what it is, we just remake it anyway.
Right. So of course, kind of one of the key things that happens is that after, it's not even really a spoiler, because I think for the most part, most of the people know the story that, he ends up being transformed into this hybrid fly human, creature and stuff like that. And but it's really striking the first time it's really revealed. Like we can see the shock when, that he first reveals his arm and stuff like that, and kind of and I think that's an interesting thing that they do, because then it hints at the horror that is still awaiting us and everything like that. And then of course the big reveal is when we see the full head and this monstrosity, right? And it's not just a, it's not just like a, and that's what's funny too. It's not that it's a little, head on top of this human being. It's a massive, fly head and stuff. And then, we see the horror through this kind of mirrored eyes effect and stuff like that. And it's one of those kind of moments in cinema that you just can't unsee, I think.
Yeah, no, it's pretty effective in its own sort of way, I'm sure. Maybe in the 50s it was vaguely terrifying to somebody. But yeah, I mean, it is quite clever the way they, he hides his face and only gets revealed later on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, by these, the effects these days, it's not terribly frightening. I mean, I'd be surprised if my 7-year-old daughter would find it at all frightening. But I think it's more just, I mean, the idea in itself is obviously much better expressed visually in the sequel, but it's still a very sort of terrifying idea, the ability to sort of splice our genes together, and the potential horrific effects that might sort of ensue. So, I mean, the performance of the leading lady, I've forgotten her name now, but
Patricia Owens.
Yeah, Patricia Owens. I mean, she does a very good job of being very, very, very scared by it. So
apparently she's actually afraid of insects or has a phobia, and so didn't reveal until the very last minute. Like she had no idea what she was going to see. So they were trying to really capture that terror. So imagine, I guess, somebody who has a phobia, and then they kind of spring that on them and stuff. So yeah, it does come across as pretty realistic in terms of her terror and stuff.
Gotta love those movie directors. Well, it's it's convincing. It's real in that return. Yeah.
And so I think what is a major theme also is this idea of that, and I think it's a striking contrast from previous discussion. With The Right Stuff, we were talking about pushing the limits of science intentionally, and kind of having the courage to do it and stuff. And here we have a movie where Patricia's kind of echoes this idea that maybe we're going a little too fast with stuff, you know, like kind of, she says like, you know, the suddenness of our age, electronics, rockets, Earth satellites, supersonic flight, and now this. And so she's kind of cautioning him. And, you know, in reality, she's echoing somewhat our own kind of concerns, because here's this guy who, like, you know, sent the, you know, cat into the ether and stuff. And then like, you know, oh, but let's send the guinea pig. And then, oh, well, let me go through and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, there's quite a few moments in this movie that are, you know, funny, but not really supposed to be funny.
Yeah.
And for me, the ethereal cat that's just sort of meowing in space was one of those. The other one that I really enjoyed was when they first show the bit where she kills André, and the man discovering it screams as a telephone ring, which is really strange. It's quite surreal, actually, but it's very funny. They're just that moment. And then, of course, there's the bit that's supposed to be really terrifying of, you know, him getting caught in the spider web is, again, it's something that's pretty silly, really, by today's standards. But yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right in terms of science fiction. You know, this was it's a very sort of compelling idea, and you've got to remember in the 50s, science fiction and horror pretty much kind of crossed over. There wasn't really much distinction between them, and with, you know, develop of nuclear weapons, you know, anything that could possibly be any new scientific advance seems to have been put in a frame of this could potentially be really dangerous.
Yeah.
Which is why, you know, you've got a whole slew of horror movies that were all just about sort of different, almost sort of physical phenomena, you know, the 50-foot woman, the fly, and, you know, anything that where you could possibly mess around with the basics of physics could be a potential threat to humanity.
Yeah, it's funny, around this time we kind of talked about some movies that were made around this time period, you know, like The Thing,
Invasion of the Body
Snatchers, like kind of, you know, like there's this kind of time where we really were on the verge of, like, you know, going into space and stuff, like we talked about with The Right Stuff. And then so we had this kind of combination of this, you know, daring, you know, like kind of, and like, you know, oh, let's find out, stuff like that, but also like kind of this fear of like kind of, you know, what are we going to encounter once we bump up against, you know, like kind of the edge of our exploration and stuff. And
Yes.
I think that, and you know, likewise, you know, like kind of this was the atomic age, like, or this was like kind of where, you know, we had just dropped a bomb to end World War II and stuff like that, and now we're like kind of looking at, you know, kind of doing, you know, more and more bombs and stuff. And so I think it's like kind of, on the one hand, we love the fact that, like, you know, now you can, like, you know, cook your dinner in minutes and stuff like that. But on the other, we're like kind of, you know, like, okay, but are we going to become dinner, you know, in a matter of minutes?
Yeah, will we incinerate ourselves in a matter of minutes? Yeah. I mean, and in many respects, we were starting to really sort of push the limits of what was normally considered, you know, the laws of general physics. And so, yeah, obviously had a big effect. And I mean, this obviously was something that was, you know, expressed in this, obviously, strangely enough, in this one as a romance, in that you have the leading lady who is incredibly devoted to her husband, who is, you know, clearly completely focused on his project, and will, you know, stop at nothing to get his invention to work. But at the same, I think that kind of expresses also this, like you said, this kind of love-hate relationship that we have with technology itself. But it's quite a tragic kind of love story in a way, in that you know, the fact that she's the only one he can confide in, and also the only one who he really trusts to even sort of kill him at the end. So it's yeah, it's a very interesting kind of tragic love story.
And, you know, like I couldn't find anything about it, but I almost felt like this, it had almost like a metaphor for like the kind of the transgender thing, like kind of, you know, which I know it sounds strange, but to me it was like kind of, you know, imagine a guy who's like kind of, you know, diving into his, you know, kind of interests and stuff like that, and, you know, kind of, and then discovering, right, that like, oh, actually, you know, kind of I identify more as a female, stuff like that. And then so he's going through this transformation, but it's leading to this horrors and stuff. And so, also kind of being a thing of the 50s, right? This was a time where, as we talked about before, like jokingly about, Scotty Bowers and stuff like that, a lot of this kind of stuff was just in the closet. And, so, you just wouldn't talk about it. And also like, meanwhile, like kind of, the wife is trying to be supportive, but meanwhile, she doesn't know how to handle it and stuff like that. So it's like kind of a weird kind of connection. And I didn't really find much literature that kind of, made that connection, but I felt like it almost in some ways you can kind of, just go that direction with it and stuff, because here we have this age of like conformity, like kind of the 50s and stuff, like everybody, as we talk about, even with the right stuff, that these astronauts all look alike, and then they have this kind of ideal of a kind of manhood and stuff like that. And then, kind of the women, basically they're all kind of, the supportive wives and kind of, and they have all of their kind of rubber stamp of, how to behave and conform and stuff. And meanwhile, like, you have like people pushing the boundaries of like kind of discovering, we're years away from the sexual revolution and kind of discovering, yourself and all that kind of stuff. So I can imagine in some ways this is like kind of the metaphor of somebody who's like exploring like kind of, their sexuality and stuff. And then meanwhile, they stumble upon this kind of, those ideas like kind of transforming them. And meanwhile, the spouse is trying to be supportive, but they can't really handle like the changes that the one spouse is kind of undergoing.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very interesting point, actually. I mean, and I think, in some ways it could be a, also just a sort of a major transformation of one's own sort of outlook on life. You could view it in that respect as well, in almost like a sort of an ego death or a death of one's old self. Although normally when you sort of see those kind of themes in movies, there's often a rebirth as well into something sort of new, which doesn't really sort of happen in this one.
Right.
But yeah, it's I mean, you could say it's it could be transgender, could be sort of homosexuality or something like that.
Or it could be something, like kind of dark and more concrete, like drugs, like, like maybe it was them, kind of experimenting and stuff. And then, they become this addict and stuff like that. And, because here this person is addicted to work and stuff like that. But then, often addicts will find other, different outlets, so to speak, for their addictions.
Yeah, I mean, he obviously can't write very coherently when he's transformed into the fly. So
yeah, there you go.
If he is out of his skull, quite literally, then yeah, it's interesting. I mean, normally there's some sort of connection to communism when we're looking at stuff in the future, but I couldn't obviously think of a link there really between this and communism. But yeah, it's the other thing that I found interesting was is that the idea that it's told through the perspective of the brother-in-law.
Oh, right.
But a brother-in-law who is, obsessed with his brother's wife, which is a bit concerning, I suppose.
They only kind of briefly mentioned that, the inspector kind of suspects him and stuff like that. The book talks a little bit more about that. And, like it almost kind of brings out more of this kind of almost like a love triangle thing. But yeah, I mean, that's another interesting aspect that, they almost downplay it, even though, like you said, it's a lot of the, the audience perspective is through Vincent Price, who plays the brother and stuff.
I think as well, the other interesting thing for me is this idea of when on the opposite side, you've got, the big fly, André, and then you've got the small fly, which is, André's head and arm that have been transferred into the body of a fly, and this kind of powerlessness as he's in the spider's web. And that's kind of, for me, that's this a very kind of visual symbolism of nature telling you not to mess with the mechanics of it, in that, the scientist is now trapped in a web of his own sort of making, so to speak.
And I was kind of wondering also, like, where, like, even though that, like, they killed the fly that's kind of taken over the human body and stuff like that, but why wouldn't they try to, like, save the miniature person, right, and stuff in this fly, and then, like, almost like maybe try to restore, kind of him to a full size or something like that. Where the automatic thing was afterwards was to make sure to kill this this fly with the white fly and stuff like that.
Yeah, kill the human hybrid fly. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that there was and again it says this weird sort of sense of scale in that the big sort of fly was more of was a monster, and the small fly was like was an inconvenience to the world and the way we understand it, and it was easier just to kind of stamp it out and move on,
Right.
So it's it was strange how they dealt with that in two different ways.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I could think of is that they were like that they were kind of almost like treating that as like, okay, well, we failed to kind of restore, Andre to his, body and stuff like that. So, get rid of this fly because it's, like kind of, I don't know. It's almost like kind of at that point, like that's disposable, even though that actually, in theory, then it was more of Andre at that point. But
yeah,
I don't know, like, and that's the other kind of strange part too, is that like where he was behaving like Andre, but then becoming more and more the fly. And so that was like kind of the big struggle that we see, right? Like where it was symbolized, like kind of, but different times he's wrestling with the hand and everything like that. But then, like kind of, again, it's like almost like that little fly is like kind of just, like really just even, like that's because they're not even, Andre at all. Like, so.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's, well, you could say this is almost sort of a comment on how people deal with, deformity or people that don't sort of fit the mold of what's expected, or it makes people uncomfortable. It's easier to kind of try and expunge them from their consciousness, really.
Right.
But it was interesting. They had this sort of theme that he became slowly more fly-like in his behavior, and that they build on that in the remake as well.
Yeah.
But it's, I mean, obviously it makes no sense scientifically. That if he did have a head of a fly, it would probably just collapse in on itself because it's not really engineered to work at that scale.
No.
And it would probably just explode and or collapse in on itself or something. And so the fact that he would still have some remnants of a human brain in there would kind of, it wouldn't, it wouldn't actually work that way at all, if it would work at all. But this idea that what is fly-like behavior, and it's kind of a lower, a metaphor for kind of like our lower nature, i.e. something that's sort of brutal and uncompromising.
Right. And that's another, like you said, in the remake, it's kind of interesting how he kind of covers more of a discussion of that. I think one other thing that is a really interesting aspect is like that between the couple, apparently, like, Vincent Price kind of talks about it, is like how, I don't understand, like, here's this couple that has this, kind of value of life, like kind of the preciousness of life and stuff like that, which ultimately in some ways becomes their undoing because, the wife, Hélène, kind of tells the son, plays by Charles Herbert, to, let go of the fly that, has Philippe's body, the white fly, stuff like that. And then, like kind of they spend like, a lot of the third act trying to find the darn thing stuff.
Yeah, it's a few cheap scenes there. People trying to find a fly in a room is
And then, like, sadly, like kind of it leads to this ultimate struggle, right? Of like, whether to hang on and, like kind of because of the preciousness of life and stuff like that. But, ultimately, as we know, like kind of she's faced with this, one of the most heartbreaking problems of, like that people have to deal with it sometimes, is this idea of like, euthanasia, of like, not only like letting somebody go, but actually killing them and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, that's there's not many movies that I can think of where you have a love story where one person is forced to kill the other. And it's still quite sort of affecting just because of that element, I think, regardless of any of the effects or anything else. But it's interesting in that respect.
And I think that to me is like kind of one of the central kind of key parts of this story. It's like, is the romance between, the couple and stuff like that. And then like kind of this idea that, is in fact killing them sometimes an act of love. And, we definitely will see this, of course, in the remake. And yeah, in fact, maybe that's a good time to kind of transition then. So here we have David Cronenberg actually has been, of course, by this point making several different movies, and I think in the 80s in some ways was like almost like it's kind of golden era for him. He really kind of just had some really dramatic kind of films come out. This is probably one of the most commercial that he's done. We'll kind of later on talk about The Dead Zone, of course. And it's interesting how it was actually Mel Brooks that approached him. And at the time, ironically, Cronenberg was committed to doing Total Recall, and then ultimately, kind of something kind of got dropped there. So here we have a comedic, filmmaker or something like that approaching this director of body horror, who was in the middle of doing some other sci-fi, and But luckily, thankfully for us, we had Cronenberg take on this project. He brings in, of course, Jeff Goldblum, and then Geena Davis, who at the time hadn't really become as well known. She had kind of some relatively kind of minor roles in kind of some big movies like Tootsie and stuff like that, but nothing kind of nearly as big as this one and stuff. And I think, overall, she's still to this day, I feel like an underrated performer. Kind of we see the on-scene chemistry because of they were at the time a actual couple off-screen and stuff. So yeah, just a really interesting mix overall.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's some great sort of chemistry between Geena Davis and Jeff Goldblum in this, because Jeff Goldblum has been given the fairly sort of free rein to be fairly quirky and off the wall. There's bits where he's sort of randomly playing a piano and acting a bit like a magician, and he's really given sort of a lot of freedom, which is great to see, and he's very sort of charismatic in this role. And likewise, Geena Davis is seen as her character is a pretty strong, ambitious woman. Sort of kind of no nonsense really in many respects, and that plays really well against the Seth Brundle character. And I think what's interesting is that they both kind of, in a way, they're both very ambitious as characters. She's a very ambitious journalist who's really out there just to get the story, and he's also likewise, just wants to complete his experiment. And it's interesting that sort of, they find that sort of interesting common ground.
Yeah, and we've definitely have mentioned Jeff Goldblum multiple times in other kind of films and stuff. Even actually as recently as the last one with Right Stuff and everything like that. So it's interesting to kind of see him now, taking center stage and and doing just it's more than a phenomenal job. He really is kind of what really makes The Fly, with Geena Davis, of course, as kind of the equal partner. It's just that combination that really makes this film, because as we talked about that, at its core, it's a tragic love story. And ultimately, in this case, of course, she's the one put to the test of that question of do you how do you love somebody and kind of actually are part of their kind of demise and stuff like that. But of course, way before that, it's also interesting that she's in some ways, I wouldn't say responsible, but it's she's the catalyst, right? Because she's the one that gets his attention at this soiree kind of thing, and so he's showing off to her because kind of he's the joke is about him not getting out much and everything like that. And so he's kind of, watch this, kind of showing off his toy/invention and stuff like that. And then, in a fit of jealousy, he gets drunk and then puts himself through the machine and stuff. And then, misses out that the fly's in there, of course, and then that's what, of course, leads to the rest of the story.
Well, I mean, this is really the main sort of underpinning of the whole story. Is this, if you notice in the dialogue, there's a lot of bits where they sort of talk about flesh and how it sort of pulls people in, and this one is kind of, I feel in a way, is sort of a continuation of some of the themes in the Videodrome, in this idea of technology and human bodies interacting, and the limitations of both, really. There's a bit where he's kind of saying that he's got to reprogram the computer because Geena Davis is describing, how pinching a baby's cheeks is right. They want to eat it because there's this desire of the flesh, and he's like, oh yeah, well, all I've got to do now is just reprogram the computer to, really desire flesh in that same way, and that's when he can actually start sort of teleporting live creatures from one side to the other. I mean, it's this idea that he somehow teaches computers to love humans, really, or desire desire living beings is kind of what his, I mean, it's pretty tall feat, but that's what you have to imply from what they're saying in those scenes. And this is, there's that saying in Videodrome, long live the new flesh, and that's kind of what you're seeing in this, in a much more kind of accessible, trad science fiction-y way in The Fly. It's this idea of interacting. You become obsessed, and you kind of, the technology gets obsessed with you. You become obsessed with the technology, and they kind of intermingle in ways that are unexpected and not always good, I guess.
Yeah, like initially when he first has the idea of like, like he starts off saying like kind of, that transporting material things is not a problem, and then he like kind of has his idea like kind of teleporting steak, and he kind of like does the two steaks, like kind of the teleported one, the what's called the regular steak, and then like she almost like wants to throw up like kind of when she tastes the teleported steak, because apparently like kind of it looks like steak and feels like steak, but it's not steak, and so it's interesting how like it's there was something lost in the translation of flesh. It's almost like there's some kind of magic to it that like has to be captured, and so like you said, ultimately only when this kind of love, if you will, is of the flesh is kind of discovered by the computer, that then it transforms. And I think that's another funny part too, is like now, being the 80s, I guess we started kind of realizing the the value or the power and / limitations of computers, because in the original there is no computer that's kind of part of the process stuff, but here it's pretty integral, like all the controls and all that kind of stuff. We will constantly see like the computer's interaction. So I think it's like almost a reflection as at the time that we're just starting to kind of, with the real world, so to speak, to get a grasp of like how computers really allows us to kind of interact with technology in ways that like we weren't able to have before.
Yeah, no, I mean, we were much more aware of that. You're right, the limitations of computers, but also on by the other sort of side of the coin, the 80s was really a time when we started to tinker with and understand the possibilities of the actual human body. That's when we started getting things like steroids and people bodybuilding. So you had that kind of stuff. Surgery, everything else was getting more sophisticated, and of course the starts of psychotherapy that we see in the 70s has now become a fairly sort of standard practice of people sort of getting therapy for all sorts of things. So there's this idea of mentally and physically improving yourself, which is why you get these sort of the Adonises and the sort of hard body women in 80s movies. Is this physical perfection is something that's kind of celebrated on screen all the way through the 80s. So I think The Fly and probably Videodrome as well is this idea of sex and idealized physical bodies being contorted and thrown back in our face, essentially. And there's definitely an intrinsic link with sex in The Fly, in that if you notice, the first time they sleep together, he rolls over and he's got this microchip embedded in his back, which is, again, this first sort of signifier that he's becoming one with the technology.
Oh, okay.
And of course ends right at the end when he does sort of merge with the telepod itself.
Oh, yeah.
One with the technology.
Right.
But then, you know, the more he gets involved, the more he desires for flesh, the more he becomes transformed himself in various different ways.
Right.
So, you know, and he goes through this whole kind of arc of, he becomes super strong and amazing and everything else, and then sort of, you know, falls to pieces. But then, interestingly enough, kind of transforms, and actually, that's one of the most interesting and funny scenes, is this bit where he's kind of got over the trauma that this is happening to him, and he's just accepted, okay, I'm Brundlefly now. I'm just like, my teeth are falling out, my nails are all gone, but hey, look, I can stick on the ceiling and things like that.
Right.
And you know, just that classic scene where he just vomits up over food and says,
oh my god,
this is probably disgusting, isn't it? Like,
yeah.
I mean, it's really darkly funny, but yeah.
That definitely is a funny part about this too, is that and I actually didn't know this, but apparently, you know, kind of Cronenberg has a background in science and stuff. Like, in fact, he thought he wanted to be a scientist and you know, like, kind of get more into writing, you know, that kind of thing, to become like an Isaac Asimov and stuff. But then ultimately decided that, like, well, actually, you know, I'd rather be able to kind of even write the science and stuff. So then that's apparently why he got more into kind of science fiction filmmaking. But you know, we do have this kind of aspect of kind of human and animal, because, like, you know, one of the quotes I love is, like, you know, I'm an insect who dreamt he was a man and loved it, but now the dream is over and the insect is awake rather. That's apparently
really thing, isn't it?
And that's when he's like, he's warning her that, like, you know, hey, you know, like, you know, if you stay, I'm gonna, you know, hurt you, that kind of thing and stuff. And it's like kind of it's a realization that, like, you know, that sometimes within even, like, you know, somebody who isn't turning a fly, that, like, we have this kind of animal part of us that can be awakened and stuff like that. Like, certainly in, you know, like, kind of combat or stress and stuff like, and all that. And then also Cronenberg talks about kind of insect politics, or through Brundle, that you know, like, I mean, there's this kind of other world that, like, you know, for the most part, it's very kind of animalistic in the fact that, like, you know, it just might is right and all that, but there's this kind of also degree of organization, and where, you know, you have like bees or colonies of ants and stuff like that. So it's like a mix of, like, you know, very animal, but then also to some degree social, and in the sense of, like, you know, organized together and more mindless stuff.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, we often associate this kind of thing of, like, something that's a lower sort of animal life form would be more sort of, wouldn't have any empathy or compassion, or would be sort of antisocial or something like this. But I mean, actually, I don't think that's very true. I think the more you look into sort of animal stuff, you know, they're very codependent on all sorts of relationships, and likewise, even when you go back to trees and in forests, it's like, you know, the large trees can't actually survive without the various other things. You know, even though they have a canopy protecting them, they can't actually survive without the mycelium and things underneath it. So it's you know, the survival of the fittest sort of idea is actually fairly misplaced, I think, in terms of the natural world. But it's obviously a theme that you know, you see in anything where people are transforming into animals. So.
And I guess along the lines too about, you know, kind of the sexuality and stuff like that is, you know, the Cronenberg himself denies that there's any kind of connection to AIDS and stuff. But, you know, as we talked about before, also with, you know, some of the other discussions we had, I think it's just, you know, like just one of those kind of things that's a topic that was on everybody's mind. So it's almost like maybe even unavoidable to think about it. You know, like we kind of mentioned about, like, kind of in The Thing and, you know, The Ring and stuff like that, like, you know, just this idea that, you know, your body kind of turning in on itself, you like kind of leading to its own destruction. I mean, you can't but look at like, the transformation happening to Seth, to kind of, just basically, like see that as a metaphor for, like kind of this disease that kind of ravaged people and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, definitely. Yeah, it would be easy enough to do that, but it's interesting that, I mean, he kind of denies that, and I can understand why, because I mean, there's also a lot of bits in the dialogue where he talks about transformation. He talks about when the bit where he's sort of starting to realize that he's got this super strength, and he thinks that whenever you go through the telepod, you become stronger and better.
Right.
He's there saying, you're just being weak. You're not accepting the future potential. And he said, this creates, and this almost, I think this is more about drugs perhaps than about AIDS in a way, because he's there. If you notice, he keeps going back and back through the
right
in order to try and kind of enhance himself in a way, because he says he feels like a high, like a drug. And he says this is a type of desire that goes beyond sex. It's like something that's kind of which is often, people will kind of draw that similarity to sort of drug use or something like that.
Right. Yeah, chasing that high.
Yeah, but he talks about in terms of like transforming himself into something beyond, human, essentially.
Yeah.
And in some ways, this is almost like the same sort of rhetoric you hear from AI transhumanists. So you kind of feel like they're all like a little bit like Seth Brundle in The Fly.
Oh no. Yeah, I mean, certainly, I can, like you said, see that, like not wanting to kind of draw that connection and stuff like that. At the same time, it's just, yeah, as we said, like such a thing of the time and stuff like that, and along with drugs, and also coincidentally excess, right, where it's like kind of just this kind of ball of like kind of things that really, it just feels like it echoes, because like there's a scene where he's like kind of just basically dumping like the sugar into the coffee, and she, Geena Davis's character, like kind of, do you like some coffee with your sugar? That's like one of those lines that like kind of, that and be afraid, very afraid, like kind of the two catchphrases that like really stand out from this movie and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's kind of, there was a real kind of thirst, we will say, for sex and violence during the 80s, and you got it in as much as extreme as people could make it, really.
Right.
There's no holds barred, really, and then some directors did that without irony, and some did it with, and I would say Paul Verhoeven and David Cronenberg are ones that did it. They sort of realized this was pretty crazy, but took it to extremes. Yeah.
I think the thing that stands out about this is, and what you just said too, like kind of really is part of what makes it this like a great way to start our discussion about David Cronenberg, is that the two main 80s genres, I'd say, like kind of were either the teen slashers, right, and stuff, and then also like the action, kind of Arnie slash, the RoboCop type of thing that we've seen and everything. That's like kind of what the big money makers. And here we have this movie that's like neither of these. It's at its core love story, and then it's at its core this kind of body horror kind of that's based on something from the 50s too, for that matter. And I think that really like kind of stands out, like in my mind, that how like that David Cronenberg's basically like kind of he's like saying I can go down these other routes, but no, I'm going to go down this one and stuff.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a very interesting route. It's one of the most interesting movies that could even be classed as science fiction or horror from the 80s.
Yeah.
I think it really stands out. I mean, there's lots of other sort of interesting little touches that are very sort of Cronenbergian in that all of a sudden, when Geena Davis is first starting to film Seth, there's a point where we jump to the perspective of the video camera that she's using.
Right.
And again, this is almost like a precursor to the found footage
Oh,
kind of
right.
stuff that we got in the 90s, and that you're
Yes.
seeing it very much as a videotape,
Mhm.
and kind of draws you into the story a lot more.
Yeah.
And you sort of see him trying to rehearse, but he's failed, so he's having real difficulty trying to do it. So that was a very interesting and unexpected bit that I'd totally forgotten about. Also, there's a bit later on where he can't quite understand what's happening to him, and he's not sure if this is real or if it's a videotape.
Oh.
I can't remember. He
Right,
talks
right.
about whether, is this live or is this just, I don't
Memorex.
know. Memorex, yeah.
that was like one of those kind of commercials that was big at the time.
Yeah. So again, he's already, and this is sort of later explored in some of his movies like Existenz and things like this idea of, will technology make reality too real, and how would we tell the difference?
Right.
Basically. Yeah. So that was quite an interesting bit. The other thing that just I'm not entirely connected to all these themes is that this idea that he's so obsessed with his work that he only has sort of 5 outfits, which is very sort of minimal. And he nicks that idea from Einstein, but his lab is supposed to be this kind of very sparse industrial kind of science lab. And I couldn't help thinking now, well, that's quite trendy now, actually. If you went to see his lab, people would say, oh, is this, almost looks like a coffee shop in there. It's like this, kind of very sparse industrial loft space. And it almost, and there's a part of me that thought, well, this is interesting because we're actually looking at like a film set where they have purposefully tried to make it look as like something that's a living space, but is kind of purely there for function only.
Yeah.
And then I thought that's exactly what the whole kind of industrial interior design is about. It's kind of there's this saying, and with Italian men's sort of tailoring sprezzatura, which is this idea that you kind of try to look casual, but you actually spend like about 4 hours in front of a mirror making yourself look kind of smart, but kind of just a little bit messed up to make it look like you just like thrown it on carelessly. And I kind of feel that's the same thing with industrial kind of interior design. It's this idea that it's supposed to just be a kind of, thrown together functional workspace, but actually probably cost you like, $500,000 to do it or something. So.
Right.
Yeah, it's just an interesting observation for me.
Yeah, and ironically, it's like kind of at this point, like kind of it's a guy who's really just literally doesn't get out much and kind of just nerdy and kind of but meanwhile he's achieved like this design slash kind of look that now is like kind of trendy years later and stuff. So there's another way ahead of his time.
But it makes you wonder if that's the whole appeal of these kind of spaces, is that it's just like, well, I'm just so busy breaking the laws of physics here to worry about, chintzy home decor. That's why there's pipes everywhere, right? Because I'm just too busy to worry about it. Anyway,
absolutely.
We're way off topic there, but yeah, it's I'm trying to think whatever is. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you notice as well, there's a lot of mentions of cheeseburgers.
Yes.
Which is this idea of, again, it's like processed flesh, basically.
Yeah,
There's a lot of this kind of thing of like sex and then meat intermingled all the way through the movie, which is kind of, again, this kind of thing of like, are we more than just a sort of pile of meat that can be disassembled and reassembled?
Right.
Speaking of which, where does Seth Brundle get his baboons? He seems to have an endless supply of baboons. So I don't know where do you go to get experimental baboons at short notice, but he seems to be able to get them.
I don't know. I guess maybe there's some kind of science catalog that you can order baboon. And it is Canada, so maybe they have different customs over there.
Maybe. Yeah, famous Canadian baboon smugglers. Yeah, I mean, I think as well, it's kind of, I'd be interested to know what David Cronenberg's take is on vegetarianism and things like this, because with so much sort of meat, and the fact that when there's also like this sort of visual thing of when he starts turning into the fly, you'll notice before that, he's a scientist wearing his tweed kind of university jacket. And then Geena Davis buys him this leather jacket, which of course is like animal skin and sort of black and shiny, like a kind of an insect. So he starts wearing that when he's being transformed. But that along with the steak and everything made me thought, like, is Cronenberg, is he like a, you know, radical vegan or something? Is he really trying to tell us something about how we?
You know, it's funny you say that, because now what I'm remembering also is that, like, part of the whole power lunch experience was to like order steaks and that kind of thing and stuff.
Yeah.
And then leather jackets were like kind of, you know, so it just was another aspect of the excess and kind of, you know, consumerism and stuff that was kind of really, you know, and that's another thing we've talked about in like, you know, Dawn of the Dead and stuff like that. There's like kind of this almost culture of, you know, like consumerism and excess. And
I think, yeah, you're right. In a way, yeah, consumerism, I think it, funnily enough, is commented on this in a almost an opposite way, in that we have Seth Brundle as who's transforming into this sort of futuristic gene spliced experiment that he, rather than consuming things, he vomits on things. You know, this is his, you know, the guy who's the corporate kind of sellout, who's a bit of an asshole. You know, he vomits all over his hands and disintegrates them.
Right,
So,
yeah.
you know, and this is his, yeah, in some ways, literally doing the complete opposite of consumption. Well, he has to in order to eat, but yeah, that's and I can't actually think. I mean, it's still pretty disgusting, even now, to watch all those scenes. Like, there's never really been anything where you've seen someone vomit someone to death in a movie like The Fly.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing in that respect.
Yeah, I mean, that was like far one of the most brutal effects slash scenes that, like, you know, I can't think of many that are like that, except for, you know, somewhat of a spoiler of like Raiders of the Lost Ark, where, like, you know, the Nazis kind of literally get destroyed by the Ark. I mean, so it's like, you know, probably apocalyptic level destruction there.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Sort of melting flesh was quite a big thing in the end, wasn't it?
Yeah.
But and again, though, I kind of see that as in a way, as this kind of thing of I immediately just think of sort of acid trips and things like this, where it's kind of like you're disassociating yourself from your body in a way, as a way of a kind of a spiritual or mental journey, and I kind of feel that's sort of, it's Seth's is just like a bad trip, really, in that he has to sort of first of all, he's sort of gets really into his newfound powers, but then has to kind of completely let go of anything that was even vaguely human about himself, and then does that, becomes quite funny about it, but then obviously, you know, it all goes rather horribly wrong. But yeah, you know, there's I suppose in a way we saw that a little bit with RoboCop as well, this idea of you know, you let go of any of your sort of normal physicality and then learn to accept what you've become, really, in a way. It's kind of an interesting thing. But also, I was going to say, the other bit we haven't mentioned in terms of this theme of sexuality and relationships, and it not only, and I think it's a kind of a metaphor for how it transforms you from a single person into a sort of a couple, and what it can sort of do, but also, of course, the dream sequence pregnancy, abortion, which was pretty horrendous. It's the giant maggot that comes out is pretty horrific. I mean, that in itself was yeah, that's definitely the stuff that nightmares are made of.
Yes.
And I was really surprised, actually, because I thought, oh, this is going to be kind of fun, but watching you know, a lot of these scenes again in The Fly, I was like, wow, this is really pretty shocking still. It's pretty affecting, a lot of these scenes. They're pretty good.
Yeah, and you know, it's apparently when for one of the DVD collections, he had to go back and, of course, watch the movies to give the commentary. Cronenberg said he was actually pretty horrified himself, like, because one of the things that he says he doesn't do, for the most part, he doesn't watch his movies, you know, except for, of course, you know, for the editing, and then these DVDs, and he says he hardly even does these anymore. But yeah, I mean, it's to me, like, what really captures it is Geena Davis. Like, ultimately, you know, she's our stand-in, and so when we see the horror and we see the kind of just the heartbreak and stuff like that, it's really through her eyes. And so she, like, to me, like, that's kind of like what really you know, just in my mind, elevates her as a performer, just because of the fact that, like, she really, like, you know, you just feel like kind of, it's so genuine, like, kind of just, you know, between that range, that it just kind of was been one of my kind of I mean, she's been in many different things, but this is like kind of one of her best films, I think, and stuff like that. And I think it's also like probably what started getting her those juicier roles, like because up to now she's been relatively a what's called a relatively minor character and stuff for the most part, except for like kind of relatively minor roles and stuff in minor films.
Yeah, I think what's very very sort of touching is when there's that, in a way, that kind of sorrowful empathy when she sees that Seth has dragged this other girl from the bar back to the house, and he's trying to force her to go through the telepod, and she's there telling to go away, but also she's just very aware that there's something deeply wrong with him. But the fact that she still kind of tries to help him all the way through that is really it's very touching, I think. And that is one interesting difference between the original and this, is that you've got whereas with Andre in the original, you get, as soon as the experiments happened, he's very clearly aware that he's made a huge mistake, and that, he's fairly doomed from that point out. Whereas in this one, you've got this very interesting arc of where he's completely convinced that he's and actively trying to push and persuade people to go through this telepod. And so it's almost like the fear of science from the 50s is gone, and it's been replaced by a kind of hubris in the 80s of like, we can do anything now.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's another aspect of it that we probably around the 80s is, like I said, with the genetics and stuff like that, that we started kind of having this Kool-Aid, I guess, like kind of like that, hey, science is kind of the solution to everything and stuff. And then, technology. And I think we kind of started leaving behind, like you said, the fear of, science and technology. And yet at the same time, like kind of, we had like kind of, things like AIDS, things like, even the threat of nuclear war was like kind of, it's something we forget, like kind of, at that point, the threat of nuclear war was very big. And we just kind of now take for granted that there was a time that like, you just never knew, like kind of when there's this kind of mutual destruction that was looming over the horizon and stuff.
I think what's also kind of interesting about the 80s in say, compare it to movies these days, is that in the 80s, if you had superpowers, you didn't get them for any good reason. If you had superpowers, it was probably because you were like a merciless soldier who killed anyone, or you were, some sort of evil teen slasher, or you were an alien, or you had something experimented on you, like the Toxic Avenger had a most, facile kind of version of it. But it was like, if you had superpowers, there was nothing, there was often a dark side associated with them. Whereas now, we just kind of would go and watch like, Iron Man, and everyone has superpowers and great and everything. But that was definitely a theme through the 80s, and there's a price to be paid for your own kind of exceptionalism, we'll say.
That's an interesting kind of observation, because we didn't have so much of the like this idea of like Luke Skywalker, right, of that he had this kind of gift that still hadn't taken hold yet, like in other words, it like you always had the power, but you just didn't know about it. It seemed like that wasn't really as big of a thing as it's become now more recently, like kind of that with mutants and like X-Men and stuff like that.
Well, I would say in the original 77 one, you could have powers and there wasn't necessarily a dark side. But what was the first Star Wars movie of the 80s? It was Empire Strikes Back, right? So you understand that whilst Luke is this incredibly gifted Jedi, it's because he's the son of like this incredibly evil guy that's taking over the universe, and that's where he gets his power from.
Right.
It's like that's a very 80s take on superpowers in a way.
I see. but yeah, it's interesting how, like, you know, like you said, that there was a price to pay for for the exceptionism and stuff. Less so now that, like, now it's almost like that at some point, probably around that time, you started preaching more like, you know, oh, everyone's special, everyone's great. So like, this became more entitlement, right? And now we're living in the age of, you know, the age of entitlement.
Yeah, why everyone, you know, why you have movies with 40 superheroes in it,
because everybody's special,
and you know, and there's like, and you know, no, just to be jaded about it. But yeah, I mean, I would say that as well. You know, this is definitely one of the best remakes we've watched.
Yeah,
I would say. I mean, this is one that's clearly better than the original in many ways.
Yeah.
So it goes on that very short list of remakes that vastly are better than the original. I mean, along with
Ding.
The Thing, The Thing, and I don't know. Have we watched any others recently that we can obviously say are better than the originals?
I'm trying to think now. We did see one recently that kind of we did find remarkable. Let's see, and it definitely wasn't Amityville Horror.
No, it wasn't that one. No. Oh, I can't remember now. But anyway.
Yeah, we'll have to kind of look at our notes again. But so you know, this is, as we mentioned, kind of the first of our looks at you know, David Cronenberg in this kind of original versus remake theme. And you know, next one we'll be looking at is Rabbit, which was also like is actually one of his earlier films and stuff. So it's interesting how this one is a Cronenberg remake of a sci-fi movie, and then so the next one we'll be looking at is the flip of that, which is kind of a recent remake of a David Cronenberg original movie. So we'll see how that goes. So once again, I'm John Cheng, Dan Edmonds, and we'll see you at the movies.